you have any questions, we'll start with the mic.
What should I do? Should I sit or? Okay.
Dr. Woodridge has the first question.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, this is all very convincing and vivid. I'm just curious, though. I don't know much about this. If one of the, in your opinion, smartest, best equipped opponents of ID were sitting here this evening, what would be their best arguments they would try to bring here to try to shoot down?
Sure.
Do you want to do Jerry Coyne or who would be a good example of a staunch anti-action?
Sure, yeah, Coyne is a good example. He's an evolutionary biology professor at the University of Chicago. So first of all, there really is no explanation for how things like the genetic code arose and how, basically the first life form arose to have that DNA protein system that's interpreting all the information in our DNA. You're not going to get an answer to that from evolutionary scientists. They will throw out what I would call a hand-waving objection. And this really is, the best answer we will get. They will try to explain the origin of these irreducibly complex molecular machines through something called co-option, okay? So co-option is the idea, according to Darwin's theory, when something is evolving, it sort of has a function, and that function gets improved on over time, and things get more and more complex, okay? But co-option says that maybe some features of the cell actually are originally doing something else. They're originally there for some other purpose, and then they get borrowed or co-opted, and then those parts will get retooled and tweaked and sort of changed, so then they can spontaneously come together to form an entirely new system, okay? You think this is not a good argument. This literally is the response that we get to irreducible complexity. So for those of you who maybe have not been around the block as many times as some of us have, I know these are complicated scientific debates, but you can sometimes tell who has the better argument just by looking at the nature of the objections that you get, all right? Or the responses that you get. This literally is the response that we get. It's called co-option. And so essentially, us in the ID community, we've said, okay, well, in our experience, what kind of a cause is capable of taking parts, retooling them, and then causing them to spontaneously come together to form a new kind of machine? I mean, that doesn't happen by chance. It doesn't happen naturally. You need intelligence to make co-option work. So, although they will cite co-option, I have never seen a co-option-based stepwise explanation, showing one step at a time, how did the flagellum come together? I've never seen a co-option-based explanation for a molecular machine like the flagellum that actually has any level of detail. Really they will just say, well, look, we can envisage all these different systems being pulled from other parts of the cell and then sort of spontaneously coming together to form a flagellum. And I'm sorry, but that doesn't happen in biology, okay? That's just not a viable answer. Now, on the fossil record, the answer you will get there is they will cite you some specific examples of transitional forms, okay? Now, obviously, I don't have time to get into all this in great detail, but I can go through a couple examples right now. They will say that, look, there are a few examples in the fossil record of organisms that appear to be intermediate, all right? Now, I'll talk about a couple of those right now, but let me give you just the big picture. The big picture is that when you look at the overall pattern in the fossil record, even if we acknowledge, even if we grant for the sake of argument that those transitional forms are there, the transitional forms tend to be very few and far between. And the dominant pattern really is one of repeated explosions and abrupt appearance of new forms of life. And those quotes that I showed are from mainstream science sources. Those are not me making this up, all right? And they're acknowledging that abrupt appearance of new forms of life is what we typically see. So that is the dominant pattern. I give you quote after quote after quote from paleontology sources acknowledging this point, all right? So if we find a few potential transitional forms here and there, my initial response is, well, even a broken clock is right twice a day, okay? So that doesn't necessarily mean that the pattern is one that demonstrates, sort of this gradual Darwinian evolution of life. But when we start to scrutinize many of these transitional forms, they fall apart upon closer examination. For example, I'm actually working with a medical doctor right now who is writing a book for kids about fossils. And she wants some feedback. So she's writing about these supposed feathered dinosaur fossils. You guys heard of those? Okay. So when you look at the feathered dinosaur fossils, initially it will, by the way, I'm sorry if I was talking too loud there, I tend to project. Thanks for turning it down. So feathered dinosaurs, you might think, oh, is this good evidence that birds actually evolved from dinosaurs? Well, when you look at these fossils much more closely, yes, there are fossils that have feathers. However, they fall into one of three categories, okay? Either they're not, the fossils that have feathers turn out to not actually be dinosaurs, they're actually birds, okay? That's number one. Number two, some of the things that they claim are feathers are not feathers at all. It's what some of the critics, and there's even critics in the mainstream evolutionary community who are skeptical of feathered dinos, they will call it dino fuzz, all right? It's more like collagen or hair-like structures, not actual, panaceous feathers like what a bird uses to fly with, okay? And then there are also a few of these fossils that have turned out to be fake. So not typically, so I don't use that as a major explanation, but some of them have turned out to be frauds. So the bottom line is that when I look at the evidence, I'm not aware of any true examples of a feathered dinosaur fossil. I know some people believe that there are, but when you scrutinize the evidence really is not that strong. You look at the ordering of the fossil record, and Archaeopteryx is a very famous fossil. Archaeopteryx is generally considered to have been a true bird. Okay, it actually was a bird, much, much closer to birds than it is to dinosaurs. Well, Archaeopteryx shows up in the fossil record about 20 to 25 million years before the feathered dinosaurs, which I'm skeptical of, but before those feathered dinosaur fossils lived. So you can't have your supposed ancestors coming 25 million years after when you lived, okay? So there's a major sort of ordering problem, chronological problem with the claim that these feathered dinosaurs are transitional forms. They can't be transitional forms. They actually show up in the fossil record millions and millions and millions of years after we already see true birds in the fossil record. So this kind of thing is very common. When you scrutinize these transitional forms, on closer scrutiny, they kind of don't work as transitional forms. So anyway, that would be my, that would be the response that we get, and then, you got a back and forth going, yeah.
So I just want to mention a couple of things that Casey has. Yeah, that's a great question to sort of have to rebuttal. Casey and Dr. Byron and so on have written different books on these issues, and you can hear some of their perspectives through some of their writings. I know you have written on the question of science and faith, which is, you have the comprehensive guide to science and faith. Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, I'm reading this one now, but in this book, Stephen Meyer talks a little bit about three major things, DNA being one of them, which he spilled a lot of ink in this one, the signature of the cell, talking about specifying complexity. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things there. Richard Dawkins, of course, has written The Blind Watchmaker. You guys saw the quote there from Richard Dawkins. And their view, again, is no matter how well something looks designed, it is not designed, clearly, because there's no designer, there's no God. And Richard Lewontin from Harvard University actually said, no matter how absurd it is, we will never allow God in the picture. So we will believe anything else to explain how the universe came to be. Anyways, interesting. Now, my personal experience is one of the people that you might have met. Did you meet Philip Johnson by chance? Okay, so one of the founders of intelligent design, his name was Philip Johnson. He's actually a lawyer. And I was thinking of you yesterday, you kind of trying to follow similar footsteps because a lawyer trying to change science, which is very cool. But what happened was, this is my experience, just so the students know how I got into this. I came to America to be a pediatrician. I took philosophy of science because I heard that the teacher was teaching there was no God, and I took it for fun because I didn't have to, but I took the class just to get into a good debate. And what happened was, they talked about the transitionary forms, and that worldview is important because if you believe that everything moved from point A to B, then you will find you're trying to find what that transition is. And so anyways, I explained to them my worldview is one of creation, and if God created this and he created that, then if something looks like it's in between, it can be its own creation. That's my viewpoint. Anyways, I shared that with the class. It was interesting. And here's what happened in that class. I'll just share this part, which is interesting. We read a book on evolution by Larson, so we read a whole book on the history of evolution. And then we read the book by Philip Johnson called Darwin on Trial. I highly recommend that book, Darwin on Trial. It does a very good job of challenging the theory of evolution. And then we read a book about intelligent design. So we read one on creation, we read one on intelligent design. And then the last book of the semester, just to give you guys a perspective about colleges, we actually had to read Philip Kitcher's book called Living with Darwin. So it's not, the way the class presented it is, okay, this has been a great class, but the last book we're going to read is basically evolution. Darwin is it. Like, that was the end. That was the synopsis. That was the mic drop. And of course, at that point, I got myself into some debates, and that was how I moved my way out of med school into academia, because I said I want to reason rather than just treat kids cold and stuff like that. So anyways, I want you guys to know that there's definitely intense debates going on in our classrooms, and we want our students to be aware of the different views that people are holding to as far as creation and then as far as evolution. Even within evolution, there's different viewpoints within evolution, right? There's a whole spectrum, so it's good to be aware. And so I just wanted them to kind of be aware of a little bit of my background and some of the things I experienced. You've done a lot of work in classroom stuff too, and I didn't know if you wanted to share a little bit about that. As far as evolution being taught in the classrooms and trying to challenge that. And of course, you got yourself in trouble before people were getting in trouble on the internet. But how did you handle that, trying to challenge evolution in the classroom?
Sure, so at Discovery Institute, we get contacted by a lot of parents and teachers, and school board members, and state legislators who are really fed up with what typically goes on in public schools. I mean, you guys are very fortunate to be at a private school that allows you to have these conversations and talk about these issues in a really informed, objective way. But the vast majority of public school students are learning sort of a pro-Darwin only view in a very dogmatic fashion, where evolution is really pushed on the students without any opportunities to ask questions or learn about the evidence that challenges evolution. And this was my experience. I mean, I went to public schools from kindergarten through my master's degree, and I went to a very large inner-city public high school in California. Actually, Snoop Dogg went to my high school. So, I went to a pretty rough high school, actually. But, so my experience was very much this kind of a thing, that it was the pro-Darwin only view that was being taught. So when people come to us and they ask us, what can we do to change that? First of all, Discovery Institute does not recommend taking evolution out of the classroom. We're not saying that evolution should be removed. We think evolution should be taught. Students need to understand it, even if they don't agree with it. It isn't part of biology, and it's a very dominant idea. So students need to understand evolution. We also say that they should not be pushing intelligent design into public schools. The reason why is when ID gets pushed into public schools, that leads to lawsuits, and that those lawsuits politicize this debate, which cause a lot of persecution of pro-ID scientists in the academy. So we're not looking for lawsuits. We think that our priority with intelligent design is to see it grow and develop as a science, not to turn it into a political hot potato. And so we want to see ID sort of continue to progress as a science and not, just become a subject of lawsuits and that sort of thing. Now, that being said, we don't think that they should just allow the status quo to continue, where they're only teaching this pro-evolution only view. And so what we suggest that public schools do is to teach the evidence for and against evolution. Don't necessarily bring in ID as an alternative, but focus on what we call the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of evolution. And this kind of an approach is on very strong legal grounds. We found that it's worked in quite a few different states around the country have adopted policies to either require or permit teachers to critique evolution, and they haven't faced lawsuits. And so we're very confident this is a legal approach that is effective as well and allows students, most of all, to learn better science. They're now learning more of the scientific information, and they're able to look at the evidence both for and against evolution, weigh the arguments on both sides, and develop critical thinking skills, which is so important today. So really, I think that teaching evolution objectively is really a solution to many of the problems that are facing science education today. Because number one, it helps students to develop better critical thinking skills, they can weigh the arguments, and number two, it actually gets students very interested in science, because you're not just sort of teaching them, you have to just memorize this, evolution is the answer, regurgitate that on the test. You actually are allowing them to think for themselves, look at the evidence, make up their own minds, learn to think like scientists, and get interested in trying to solve these scientific debates, as you said, for themselves. So we've seen a lot of success with this kind of approach.
Yeah. One more thing before we open the questions. Would you say that, so from what you've seen in lawsuits and so on and so forth, and I don't think they've seen the movie, there's a movie about the Monkey Scoops trial. What was that called again? The one in 1920?
Inherit the Wind, yeah.
Inherit the Wind. So back then, he taught evolution in the classroom. This was in Alabama or something, and he's in Tennessee, and he was sued. Is that right?
Yeah, so this was back in the 1920s, and there have been a number of laws passed around the country that actually made it illegal to to teach evolution. Obviously today, no laws like that remain on the books enforced. It is not only to teach evolution, but a U.S. Supreme Court case in, I believe it was the late 1960s, basically said that if you don't teach evolution, then that could be illegal. Okay, so we're actually in a much less academic freedom regime. We've gone from where, yes, it was wrong. Was it wrong for them to criminalize the teaching of evolution? Absolutely. You should never criminalize the teaching of scientific theory, which is what they did during the Scopes trial. Whether I agree or disagree with that theory doesn't mean it should be illegal to teach it. I mean, you should be able to teach what you want to teach. However, we're now actually sort of in what Justice Scalia once called Scopes in reverse. Okay, where today it's basically illegal to teach anything but evolution. And this is also not a good state for education or the scientific community to be in. And so we do need to protect academic freedom so that we're not in the Scopes in reverse situation.
Thank you. Questions?
Sorry, my voice is very good, so I'll try to talk. But what would you say to people who are Christians who have felt like there's a need to take a theistic evolutionary viewpoint because of the pressure that they feel from the scientific community? That would be one. And then also, what does ID speak at all to the age of the earth, or is that something that's outside the realm of what ID covers?
Great questions, both of those. So he mentioned theistic evolution. For those of you who are not familiar with theistic evolution, it's basically the idea that God used strictly evolutionary mechanisms to create life. And there are many different flavors of theistic evolution. Some of them would be very sort of uncontroversial. It really depends on how you define evolution, okay? If you define evolution as mere change over time, you're saying, oh, well, look, God has allowed life on Earth to change over time. Maybe God actually actively intervened in the history of life to change forms of life, to cause certain new forms of life to come to existence or allow others to die off, and God is sort of actively involved in the process. I don't think that very many Christians are going to find that kind of view, objectionable. In fact, that kind of view, frankly, is very compatible with intelligent design, because we see that, basically an intelligent agent, God, is actively intervening in the history of life to make new forms of life and design them, right? So in that respect, some forms of theistic evolution are maybe not all that controversial. But when the gentleman talks about theistic evolution, in this context, what we're typically talking about is Christians who accept the same exact mainstream evolutionary theory that Richard Dawkins accepts, okay? Essentially, their views of how life has originated and then evolved over time is no different from what mainstream evolutionary science says. And they just say, well, this is how God did it, okay? So I'm not here to question the faith of those people. I think that there are some problems with the theistic evolution model. First of all, there's many scientific problems with the evolutionary view. That's the first problem. And the second problem, I would say that there's some theological tensions there, because according to mainstream evolution, evolution is at least it appears to be, an unguided, undirected process that even involves some random elements. Well, how does God guide an unguided process? Okay, maybe they have some, theological, pretzels that they can untie to explain how that works. And I'm not saying that they can't do that, but I think there's some tensions there. And it also sort of denies, I think, when we see evidence for design in life, that's because it was not an apparently undirected, unguided process that made life. It was a guided process that made life. Life does not appear to be the result of an undirected process. It appears to be the result of an intelligently planned, event or whatever happened. It was intelligently guided. It was intelligently planned, and it was not just sort of an undirected thing. So I think there's some theological tensions with theistic evolution. But the question was, are the folks who adopt this view and are Christians in the scientific community that go the theistic evolution route, are they just trying to conform to that view so that they can kind of get along and escape some of the pressures on them that might be, on them, because to dissent from the Darwinian view can lead to a lot of persecution? And my answer to that is, first of all, look, I understand that Christians in the sciences are under a lot of pressure, okay? One of my jobs at Discovery Institute is actually, and I know you know this, Amos, is to help to provide defense for scientists who are being persecuted because of their support for intelligent design or their skepticism of Darwinian evolution. Even some evolutionists who have been critical of Darwin, who have nothing to do with ID, have complained about the fact that as soon as they start to challenge Darwin, it's like touching a sacred cow. They now are no longer, they become persona non grata, they become unwelcome at scientific meetings, and they're no longer able to publish, et cetera, and they get attacked by their own colleagues simply for challenging Darwin. And they're not even saying that they think intelligent design is the right answer. They're just sort of like other non-Darwinian ways of looking at evolution. So this idea that there is pressure on scientists to, I would say, conform to the consensus mainstream evolutionary view is very real and very strong. And even there are evolutionary scientists who would acknowledge that these pressures are really on them. So I think that yes, Christians who are in the scientific community are under a lot of pressure to conform to an evolutionary view. Now, I'm not going to name names and I'm not going to give percentages because I don't know. I can't speak for anybody in particular, but those pressures are very real. And having talked to some people one-on-one, I can say I've heard from Christians who take a theistic evolution. And I have friends who would call themselves theistic evolutionists. I might disagree with them, but of course, I'm a Christian. So, we all have that in common. We can disagree on this question. But I can tell you that, yeah, they readily acknowledge that this is just a much easier route for them to go. And, in some sense, I sympathize with them. It is hard being a Christian in the scientific community, just being a Christian. And then on top of that, questioning evolution. And for many people, that's kind of like committing career suicide, okay? So, somebody like Francis Collins, who is a Christian and made it to, basically the highest ranks of the scientific community. He was the head of the NIH, right? One of the most prestigious positions in all of science in the United States. He is a full-blown theistic evolutionist. And I'm not questioning Francis Collins' faith at all, but I think it's safe to say he would not have gotten to that level if he hadn't been a Darwin skeptic. Okay? It just wouldn't have happened. Even if you're a great scientist, you're not going to get that far because they're going to basically lock you out. And I've seen it happen many times. So yeah, the pressures are real, and I think it does happen for sure.
So then, with the age of the Earth question, which I'm going to give them homework. So students, biology students, if you don't mind, we do still need to finish our homework of listing all the different views and types. So for example, when you say you're a young Earth, what are we saying? Your old Earth, what are we saying? Does that make sense? So you should have those different definitions. That's due on Thursday. I'm kidding. They don't have to do it by Thursday. But let's have that handy though, because I have never met a theistic evolutionist in my life, ever, until I went to a presentation one day and a guy walked up to me, told me about Francis Collins' book, The Language of God, and then he basically told me, he looked at me strange when I said I didn't believe evolution, and he's looking at me, this was a Christian, he's looking at me like, Amos, why would you believe that too? That was my first attempt. I know people like John Polkinghorne, again, great guys. Polkinghorne has passed away. And then even C.S. Lewis, actually, in some ways, ascribed to some form of that. But my question, though, is that do you have Young Earth ID? Is that a combo? What is the age of the Earth? How does that tie in?
Yeah, so I forgot to hit that one. So yeah, within the ID community, we have some folks who would call themselves young Earth creationists, where they believe that the Earth is, only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. We have other folks who would be old Earthers, who believe that the Earth is billions of years old. I personally am an old Earther, but I have colleagues that I work very closely with who are young Earthers. And this works very well when we're talking about biology. Because in biology, you could look at the bacterial flagellum and see that it was designed regardless of how old you think it was. Whether you think it was designed, 10,000 years ago, whether you think it was designed maybe many millions of years ago, you can see the evidence for design either way. And so a lot of these arguments, they're really sort of agnostic, especially in biology, many of the arguments are agnostic about age issues. So yeah, we get support from some young Earthers. When you get into some other arguments for design, I would say, especially in physics, which I didn't have time to get into, it was in my slide deck, but I didn't want to talk your ears off all night. But when we get into physics and cosmology, there are many ID folks who would say that the Big Bang is actually a very good argument for design. And the Big Bang was not just a random, chaotic beginning to the universe. It's better described as sort of a very carefully orchestrated expansion event. That's a better way to describe the Big Bang. And yes, maybe it happened billions of years ago, but it's very compelling evidence for design. Both because we see that, the universe started off from an infinitely dense, infinitely small point, and that points to some need for some, super powerful first cause outside the universe to get the universe going in that singularity. Very, very compelling argument for design right there. And then the laws of the universe are finely tuned to allow the universe to develop in a way that allow things like stars, and galaxies, and planets to form. Now, the laws of the universe are not going to bring life into existence. For that, you need information, and information doesn't happen just on its own in the universe that we live in. You need a mind to generate the information. But you can see that the laws of the universe have been set up very carefully to produce a universe that has planets and stars where we can have this conversation, a very friendly, life-friendly universe. And this fine-tuning, when you look at the degree of fine-tuning, I mean, some of the laws of nature, one of the fundamental constants of nature, if they were different by just say like 1 part in 10 to the 100th power, then life would not be able to exist. You wouldn't even be able to have chemistry. Okay, we're talking about like the very fundamentals of nature. You wouldn't have matter, or you wouldn't have stars being able to burn, because the laws of nature have to be just right in order to have a universe where life can exist. And some of these arguments do basically adopt and rely upon a conventional age of the universe that is billions of years old. So I would say this, as an old earther, I would say to my atheist friend, look, your options are as follows, right? Either the universe was designed 10,000 years ago, or it was designed, 13 billion years ago. Either way, the universe was designed. I believe it was 13 billion years ago. I think that's what the evidence shows. But wherever direction you go, you can't escape the evidence for design. And so that's the way I would look at it.
Maybe one of these days we'll do a fun debate on the age of the Earth or the universe, and it'll be a fun debate sometime. But no, I'm just saying in terms of giving people a perspective to hear out the evidence from a design, older perspective, and then a younger perspective. So I'm a younger third, but
that's fine. And I'm not here to preach.
No, I know. No, I'm just saying it's good for dialogue.
Yeah,
because I think sometimes people don't get a chance to hear people share. And I know you, Ross, and I know it's an old universe situation, but the problem is it's hard to find cordial dialogue about the age of the universe. So.
Yeah, one of the last things I like to fight about is the age of the universe. I just think that it's a fun question, not something worth fighting over. Yeah.
No problem. And I quoted John Polkinghorne. You guys know John Polkinghorne, anybody? So John Polkinghorne was actually John Lennox's professor. You guys have heard me talk of John Lennox. John Polkinghorne would be like C.S. Lewis's contemporary. And John Polkinghorne died in about 94, 95, somewhere there. And his students, several of them won the Nobel Prize in Physics. That's not a politically correct field they give. They don't just give you a Nobel Prize in Physics, but his students were getting Nobel Prizes in Physics. Polkinghorne was a boss, right? And I didn't know much about some of his other theology, but I knew his physics. So the point is you can learn some things from people like Polkinghorne, even if you don't, agree with his cosmology, interpretation. It's just a point I was trying to bring. He wrote a great book called Belief in God in an Age of Science. And today, the greatest, people in apologetics, praise God, we have John Lennox, we have James Tour, but those would be like Polkinghorne's children. Does that make sense? Is it that cool to then go back and read from their dad, so to speak? So anyway, so go ahead.
Yeah, Polkinghorne was a big supporter of the idea of design and cosmology.
Yep.
He didn't agree with, I don't think he agreed with design and biology,
Yep.
but he definitely liked it in cosmology.
Isn't it interesting that you find someone, you might agree with them in one dimension, but then you disagree on another? Does that make sense? Because John Lennox in his book, 7 Days That Divide, actually called out his professor politely and said, I don't agree with Polkinghorne on evolution. Isn't that weird? You know what I mean? He called it. John Lennox is very polite, okay? But he called him out. So I say that to you guys just because, like, coming to America, I didn't know what a Democrat or Republican was. I didn't know age of the earth question because everybody in Nigeria, I never met an evolutionist. But then you meet people and you hear one thing about them and you have to be careful to say, tell me more. Does that make sense? So anyway, just want to encourage you with that. So questions, thoughts, comments as we wrap up. Yes?
I just got a question on food, and that is that, cells and everything, so, we just eat food. Okay, the question is that all these chemicals in the food supply, in your training, have you seen in the cells, they really break down with all the chemicals that we're eating instead of taking it? Or can the cells sort of like fight off all the chemicals and still all these machines keep working? Or do they break down in your training? Have you seen that?
Very interesting question. For sure, our immune systems are very incredible, the way that they can generate all these diversities of antibodies to help your cells in your body to be able to deal with harmful substances or harmful organisms that enter your body. So it is, it is very, very remarkable how our bodies can generate antibodies and have these immune responses. That being said, absolutely, cells can become overwhelmed, or they can face new substances that they're not ready to deal with, and then they can die. So sometimes folks, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but we'll get this objection from people. Well, how can I believe in intelligent design when there's things break or things die? Or how can I believe in intelligent design where sometimes things don't work properly in biology? And my answer to that is that in our experience, every single machine or every single technology that we've ever seen that was designed did not last forever. Okay? So it's not a problem for us to detect design, despite the fact that even our bodies and other living organisms, they die. They don't last forever. This is just the nature of the world we live in. We have the second law of thermodynamics. Things decay. In this universe, things are not meant to last forever. That does not mean that they were necessarily, not designed, because we have lots of experience with designing things that clearly, don't come about by chance. They require a mind for them to be able to be there, and yet, they break down, and eventually they don't last forever. So I think when we talk, and you weren't necessarily asking this, when we talk about, why is there death? Why is there suffering? Why do things break sometimes? This really gets into the problem of evil. And it's more of a moral question, because scientifically speaking, it's no problem to reconcile the idea that something can be designed and yet not last forever. We have lots of experience with things being designed and not lasting forever. That's not an issue. But the question is, why is that? Well, this gets into theology and philosophy. For me as a Christian, I believe that there are very good solutions to the problem. I believe that at the end of all time, God is going to recreate the world, and there isn't going to be death anymore. And so ultimately, this problem will be resolved, and the death and the pain and the suffering and the things breaking will go away. So I think that from my Christian worldview, it provides a very elegant solution to this problem. But anyway, I guess this wasn't even a question. But it's interesting to talk about this because our cells breaking down as a result of being exposed to harmful substances. I would say that this is the way that machines have tolerance limits. Our cells are not machines, but they were designed technology, and sometimes living organisms can be pushed beyond their tolerance limits and they die. That is how things are designed to operate. In this universe, nothing is designed to last forever. That being said, when you look at some of the mechanisms and the systems in our bodies that allow us to avoid hitting those tolerance limits and to fight off, bacteria, viruses, or harmful substances, it's pretty remarkable. If you want to know more about this, read Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. This is the book that got me started on learning about intelligent design and studying this idea of irreducible complexity. And he has a chapter in that book on our immune system and how it's highly complex and generates all these different antibodies. And I highly recommend reading that book.
Yeah, before I take the next question, there is a limit to tolerance for what we can eat. So, don't eat White Castle. That's the limit. The reason why I say that is because someone told me it's nice food, and I told my wife, and she told me that, no, you don't want to do that. And so I just feel like I can't do that. So there's one thing I might never do on earth, which is go to White Castle. But okay, so you have a question, but before that, sorry, there was one more hand over there.
Okay, so I'm a geologist. I have my master's in geology. I got it back in the year 2000. And it's really nice to have you here because your perspective is the closest to mine that I've ever gotten. So the intelligent design of the whole earth. But anyway, so I've heard all kinds of things from both sides over the years. But most recently, what I'm hearing from my creationist friends is Genesis 1:24. Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. And they would use that as an argument against these new forms popping up. And I'm just wondering what you have to say about that.
First of all, it's great to meet a fellow geologist. That's awesome. Let me hear more about what you do. If you work as a geologist, or
I know, I've been homeschooling.
Okay.
I taught at MSU and NDSU for a little while.
Awesome,
Not
awesome.
many geologists around here, so they accept a master's to teach classes.
Cool. That's great. Well, you're teaching your kids. It's the most important job in the world. So that's awesome. So I mean, Genesis 1:24, let the earth bring forth different forms of life. I don't see any. My view is that when we look at the we don't see common ancestry. I'm a critic of common ancestry, the idea that all living organisms are related to one another. And when I see this abrupt appearance of life, I mean, I would think that the young Earth creationists would like that, you know? And so I don't, if a young Earth creationist friend would feel like somehow, you know, my view that you know, there was life that was, you know, designed over the history of the Earth, but not in a way where it shared common ancestry. I don't know how that would contradict the Bible. But then again, you know, who am I to tell them? They have their own way of interpreting it, so they might not like it. But I don't see any contradiction there. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and we will definitely, I would love to just have one page of all the views and then have people actually share.
Yeah.
It'd be good to.
It's hard to argue when somebody else would argue against me, because I don't know, I mean, I don't see a problem there. So I guess I haven't heard that argument.
It's listed according to its own kind, so that they would say all the kinds were here at creation, so then there aren't any new kinds.
Okay.
That's what they're saying.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not an expert on Genesis, but in my view as an old earther is that even a young earther would say that, you know, on day one there wasn't life yet, you know, so there wasn't, you know, and so I would say that my view is that the days of Genesis were long periods of time. And again, I'm here preaching, you have to agree with me. I know some folks are going to disagree, and this is definitely not the topic for the night. So, but I would say, you know, these long periods of time is compatible with the way I read Genesis, but that's my view. So.
Darwin's Black Box, please. I do want to encourage you guys to check that out. I wrote to Michael Behe when I was writing my undergraduate thesis. My undergraduate thesis paper was on the blood clotting cascade as a case for irreducible complexity. And my professor actually allowed me to do it. Nice guy, let me write. He let me do a whole paper on that. Because your blood will actually not work properly if you don't have your blood clotting factors. And so you need to, when you get a cut, there's these zymogens, which are proteins that are sleeping, and then they have to wake one another up in order in order for your blood to clot. So anyways, I explained that in my paper, but Behe in his book, which created a firestorm, because it also talked about the human eye, and very fascinating topic. So we have a copy here in our library if anyone wants to read it. To answer one more thing Dr. Wardridge mentioned, which was pretty cool. So back when I was in elementary school, high school, I actually thought about being a lawyer because I loved debating. That was it. I just wanted to debate and win. It didn't matter what the topic. And so I was very stubborn. I've repented of my ways now. But when I think about those days, when I was an undergrad and I took philosophy of science, I actually said, I want the best book that goes against what I believe. And so there's a book by Jerry Coyne that was called Why Evolution is True. I'm like, give me the best, right? And I'm going to say this as a chemist, physicist, mathematician. The biologists need to be careful, or we're going to kick them out of science if they're going to talk about Darwin with such, as you said, like a sacred cow. And so anyways, that's what I learned, that the best arguments on biology, a mathematician and physicist would look and go, get out of here. And I'm not the first to say it. David Berlinski, and you work with, like David Berlinski is not a theologian like me. I mean, that's why, well, he doesn't, as far as I know, he wasn't a Christian back then. But wouldn't he have a problem with evolution, with some of its tenets?
Oh yeah, certainly there are non-religious critics of Darwin. By the way, Mr. Tarfa, I would not want to debate you. I mean, I'm a very challenging opponent on any topic, so I don't know if I'll ever be willing to debate you. You would have made a very good attorney also. I wish I was one of your students. You're probably very, very engaging as a teacher. But yeah, David Berlinski is I think he would probably...
Can you tell them who he is?
David Berlinski is a mathematician and philosopher, and he would probably call himself, you know, something like a secular Jew. I don't think he's particularly religious. He's not coming this with a religious axe to grind. But he is a major skeptic of Darwinian evolution on mathematical grounds. And what got him really interested in this is, I believe that he was tutored by a mathematician named Marcel Schutzenberger. And Schutzenberger was at a very famous conference at the Wistar Institute at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1960s. And at this conference, this was one of the first times when, it was in the 1960s, they had just discovered how proteins are being made in cells. And they were just beginning to sort of unravel how the genetic code works and how the ordering of the nucleotides is in the DNA is what determines, you know, the amino acids and proteins, and how if you don't get the right order, then things don't work, et cetera, et cetera. They were just coming to terms with the need to have the ordering of these molecules just right. And so in the 1960s, the late 60s, they had this meeting at the Wistar Institute where scientists came together, and mathematicians, biologists, et cetera, and for the first time, they put forth what they called these mathematical challenges to Darwinism. And they were beginning to realize that actually it's very difficult to explain. It's not all, some of the people that were saying it's very difficult to explain how you could get all these nucleotides, these amino acids in just the right order through random mutation alone. And Marcel Schutzenberger, I believe, was one of the mathematicians at that conference. And so then Schutzenberger, he was sort of an intellectual influence on David Berlinski, and David Berlinski was then a major intellectual influence upon many people, excuse me, in the intelligent design movement. I mean, Stephen Meyer, Michael Behe, Michael Denton, quite a few other folks. So I think it's interesting to see sort of the intellectual pedigree of ID going back to some of the early days of when scientists were first starting to realize that Darwinism had a mathematical problem. How are you going to get all these amino acids and nucleotides in the right order through random mutation?
And sometimes people say just give it time. That's what they say. But time doesn't solve it all. Now, David Berlinski did write a book called The Devil's Delusion. Remember Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion? David Berlinski wrote The Devil's Delusion. And he actually was a professor out in Rutgers University, New Jersey. Very smart man, lived in France. He gave up on academia here and moved over to France. And now I think he's hanging out with you guys, which is really cool.
He's still in France, yeah.
Oh, he's still in France, okay. Sorry, one question, and then we're going to wrap up and give you guys a chance if people wanted to chat with you after. But we'll wrap up with the questions. Well, one or two. Those are, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I enjoyed your appearance on the Andrew Clavin show this past summer. I'm a fan of this, but so you mentioned that you don't believe in common descent and that there are evolutionary processes at work. So like you don't believe in capital E evolution, but small. So I'm a follower of some creationists who propose an idea called CET, which is that there's not a single evolutionary tree, but there were many kinds created, like an orchard was created, but those do branch off as like epigenetic switches turn on and an organism goes into a different environmental niche, and it changes forms in a smaller way than glue to you, bacteria to constructors or something. Have you come across the term CET, continuous environmental tracking, and do you support it?
I've heard that, and I love a lot of what you just described. I'm very much a fan of both the idea of continuous environmental tracking and also the idea that you can have descent within limited groups, like perhaps, many cats are related, or certain carnivores are related. You can have descent within groups, or maybe various frog species are related, etc. So absolutely, and I think the idea of continuous environmental tracking really is a very interesting and potent idea that's just come up in the last couple decades as we've learned about all these new epigenetic ideas, and it can explain a lot. It can explain why you can get rapid changes in populations that then can revert very rapidly as well. And it shows that organisms are basically designed to evolve, but they're designed to evolve within limits. And they're designed to evolve very rapidly in response to environmental changes that basically allows them to come back very quickly so they can stay alive, basically. And so it really, what we're seeing is not evolution in the sense of Darwinian evolution where it's permanent, but it's more like pre-programmed, parameter. What's that?
Front-loaded.
Front-loaded, pre-programmed ability to change in response to environmental stimuli. And it's intended to be that way. And I think these are really cool ideas. I know there's a lot of interesting work going on in the creationist community. We have some folks in the ID community also think about these things, and I think that it's really cool ideas. Yeah, a lot of good, potential good science going on there. Yeah. So, good stuff.
Tanner, did you have a question?
I did. For all the young people here who want to be a scientist or geologist, who have, say, maybe just one critic telling them that you're not smart enough or you can't do that, what would you say to those young people?
Oh, great question, Tanner. And I think
Maybe it's a good word of advice as you wrap up for the young people.
yes. Look, I did my PhD, and people get really impressed. Oh, PhD must be really smart. In my view, a PhD is just, I've heard it said that a PhD is 50% luck, 50% hard work, and the rest brains. Okay? So, and I think that's actually true. Really, science and studying science and learning science is really just a measure, I think, of your ability to bang your head against the wall, work hard, and just force yourself to learn something and get a project done. It does not necessarily mean that you are the most brilliant person on earth. It means that you are tenacious and you are persistent. I think that that is probably the most important quality for doing good science, being tenacious and persistent, above being, the next Albert Einstein. I can tell you, I'm not the next Albert Einstein, right? I'm not the smartest kid on the block, but I'm pretty, committed, and I don't give up. And I think for those of you who like a challenge and who like to try a project that you just are going to keep, working at until you get it right, and you learn it and you understand it, if that is where you're at, then you can do science. And so I think that, and science isn't for everybody. That's okay, like not everybody's meant to be a scientist. There are people out there that can do art. I'm like lacking the gene for art, okay? Like I wish I could do art, or I wish I could perform music. People can do amazing things. Music professor. I marvel at people who have musical abilities. You're probably also really good at science too, but we all have different giftings. But the bottom line is that if you want to do science and you're willing to put in the hard work, you can do it. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Wow, with that said, let's thank Dr. Luskin, please. I didn't say this in the beginning, but for those who are visiting, this was thanks to Pastor Lyndon Smith and the crew at NDSU that brought Dr. Luskin, and then we kind of got him by extension. Thanks for helping organize this. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. As I said, there's going to be more conversations here. We haven't gotten into some of our more philosophical chapters in depth at biology, so we're going to be doing that later on. But Luskin Academy, of course, we meet right here. We have a homeschool hybrid program, which meets on Mondays and Thursdays, but then we have a few 5-day students or full-time students who come every day. But about 80% of our students come on Mondays and Thursdays, and that's what we love to do. We want to raise the next generation of scientists and thinkers that hopefully will go into academia and shake the world there for good. Hopefully shine the light of Christ. And I want them to be aware that it is going to be tough. Dr. Luskin works with many people. They did a movie called Expelled years ago, which I watched, that talks about people in academia that go through difficult times if they challenge the status quo. So anyways, be aware of that, young people. But we are here to support you all the way, and I just want to tell those who are visiting, that's what Luskin Academy, we do STEM courses, but we do other courses. We say the 5 C's, and I can end with that, but we say Christ exalted, community built, character development, career preparation, as well as content mastery. So that's what we want for our students. We want world-class learners. We want people to love learning. That's really what it comes down to. Find your gifts, use your gifts, flourish. And then hopefully along the way, read some good books, like The Return of the God Hypothesis. So, but yeah, I'm reading this one probably because this quote comes from a mathematician, or the challenge by Sir Simon Laplace. And Isaac Newton believed in God. The other people did not necessarily believe. So anyways, this book is very interesting. There's a lot of physicists that are I think of Victor Stenger, I think of Lawrence Krauss. They're so anti-religion or faith or Christians. And so it's good to hear some of the stories of people that have tried to speak truth. People like Lennox and Tor, and people that you work with, Dog Hacks, some great people out there. So thank you. Yes, go ahead, yes.
In no way do I want to compete with what you guys are doing here at Luskin Academy. This is amazing. But I do want to mention the Discovery Institute has an online academy. We've only got one course going so far. It's a chemistry course. It's designed for, really probably for homeschool students. So if you're interested in learning more about our online academy and the chemistry class that we have, come talk to Mr. Tarfa, and then we give you more information.
Yes, and actually I know the instructor who teaches that class, and it actually goes well with the hybrid model because you get to watch and talk to somebody else all the time. And then you can come out here and hang out with other chemists. So next year our main science is actually chemistry. And so I know the instructor, and it happens to be Dr. Luskin's wife, and so I approve of the chemistry there.
Shameless plug.
Yeah. But my bachelor's was chemistry too, and I did a year PhD in chemistry. So chemistry is fun. Geologist, well done, but I think chemistry is the way to go. But anyways, I'm teasing, sorry. But thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to close this in prayer and let you guys chat and hang out. Father, we thank you for this evening. Thank you for the opportunity to just learn about the designed universe, the world that you've made. I just pray that we'll live lives that make sense as we recognize that we don't exist by chance, but we exist for a purpose. And Lord, I pray you be with Dr. Luskin and take him back safely and meet him at the point of his need. And I pray you just help us all, Lord, to have cordial, good discussions that encourage one another as we all seek, Lord, what matters most, which is knowing you and making you known. So, Lord, we thank you for everything. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay,
Thanks again for coming.
If anybody here would like a copy of Casey's book, I have many. So
Is it this one?
let me know that one right
Okay,
there.
so this is a comprehensive guide to science and faith. And so these are great, would you call them essays?
Yeah, they're short chapters, yeah.
Short chapters. And you get to basically hang out with several wonderful people, including Dr. Luskin. There's probably about 12, 15 authors there. So check it. We have copies of that and
Just
for
let me
free.
know if you need more.
Okay, so if we need more, you can get one and read. And then I'm inviting people to join me in reading this too, so for fun. Thank you so much. Thank you.